I tried too hard is rarely something that is coupled in our minds with failure.
Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. Welcome back to So Here's My Story. I'm Jody.
I'm Elliot.
And we now have 51 members in the Facebook group. Thank you, Allison Horn. Welcome, welcome. We look forward to hearing more from you.
That was a very melodic 51, if I may say so.
It was. It seemed appropriate.
It did. So in today's story, this is Jody's story, which is a great one because it takes us through yoga terms that I did not know, yoga moves that I still could not duplicate, but really important lessons on commitment and the environment in which great commitment takes place, both in yoga and in business. Stay tuned. You ready?
Yep. So here's my story. If you recall, if you've been listening for a while, or if you just happen to know me, and certainly Elliot,
I have been listening for a while.
So in 2017, I did that Strong Woman competition. So you were all blessed or cursed with a bunch of like fitness stories. And then in 2018, and so that was my theme for that year. 2018, my theme was sitting.
Nice. How'd that work out for you?
Work got super busy and I was sitting a lot. So that was not a big fitness year. And this year I wanted to do something, but I didn't want to do the same thing. So anyway, so this year I've really been getting into yoga, but not like regular yoga, like this sort of like strength yoga, like these handstands and headstands, and like with Budokan yoga is the kind of yoga I've been taking. Anyway, So it's really interesting to me because it's like this constant movement yoga. You're not just holding a pose for like 10 seconds, which frankly drives me crazy. Clearly, I'm not a good yogi. I frankly miss the whole point of yoga when that's the point. So I'm not good at that stuff. But this I'm really, really enjoying. And you're constantly sort of like undulating different moves. And so you're always moving from one to the next. But last night I was taking this class and we were doing this section on like headstands and handstands, and we hit the most fascinating thing. So that the handstands are just still far, far, far beyond my capability. And basically me trying to do handstands is like hands on the ground, trying to understand like wrist position and arm alignment and all this stuff. And then me just sort of randomly kicking my legs into the air and them coming right back down to the ground.
Is this like, against a wall, or you have to be able to do a handstand? No, you're right in the middle of the room, but it's like but it's on a really thick mat, which actually makes it harder because it's a little bit wobbly. I wasn't talking about the mat. I was talking about the ability to stand up on your hands without any support.
Oh, I know. No, because you're in the middle of the room. You're not against a wall. You can practice that on your own, but in this class, you're just sort of like kicking up.
I do, as you well know. Yes.
No, you don't. So we did that. And then, interestingly, I actually could do the headstands, which sort of surprised me. So I was doing the headstands and, you kind of get into first your knees are on your elbows. And then I could lift my legs straight up and then sort of like tuck your knees down and touch the ground and come back up again. I had a lot of balance and like core strength, which I was pretty excited to have like some kind of win in the day. So then I was getting a little bit confident.
Cocky.
I was a little cocky. I'm like, check me out. I'm doing the thing. And he's like, let's try it again. I'm like, I can do this thing. And I'd felt so flailingly bad for a good portion of the class that I was just psyched to be doing like a part that I could do. So I'm in the handstand and I'm trying to, and all of a sudden I'm starting to lose it, except I was losing it like the wrong way. And I go the rest of the way over and sort of do a back bend unintentionally, and fall to the floor. And instantly I have this sort of like nervous laughter, like kind of embarrassed that I flew all the way over. And he stops. And this is what made me, I was like, oh my God, we have to do a story on this. I hope I can remember another 20 minutes so that I can write it down. He goes, guys, I want to point something out. He said, when you're doing handstands or when you're doing headstands, everybody is, interestingly, notice, very comfortable with the part where you kick up and legs come down. You kick up, your legs come down. You kick up like that. Nobody even technically categorizes that as falling, right? Because it's just like the up and down part. He said, but what always happens is when somebody makes it all the way up or kicks too hard and goes all the way over, especially in the very beginning, they get really embarrassed, like they did something wrong. He said, but here's the thing you have to notice. The only way you don't risk going all the way over is if you didn't really commit to getting all the way up. He said, the problem why people kick and kick and kick and kick and can't get up is because they're not really committed to going straight up, because they're afraid if they do, they'll go the rest of the way over. And he said, so if you're not regularly falling over into the back bends, you need to take a look at your relationship with commitment, and not just in this class.
Wow.
And I was like, whoa. I almost got up to get a piece of paper to write it down. I was like, that is deeply profound, because you can't argue the point of it. The reason I wasn't even coming anywhere close to a handstand and anywhere close to if I was trying to do a headstand kicking up, I wouldn't have been able to either, because I was able to do the headstand just by sort of like straightening my legs up and staying in a tight core position. So I thought that is just fascinating, that if you're not kicking hard enough, if you're not really putting the commitment behind it, you're never going to get there.
No, I do. I agree with you. I think it's a great point. I think it's fascinating. And there's an inherent truth that talks about the relationship between commitment and failure, and what failure looks like. And failure, as you know, of course, we've talked about this, comes with so much baggage, meaning that it's a horrible thing, failure.
Right.
And
we can say till the end of the day, like, failing is part of the process. And I know that, and I believe it, and it's true. I still like giggled nervously because I was embarrassed that I had like overshot it. But because I think what I so appreciate about this story is it suddenly dissects quite visually these two things that are technically both failure, but one we just inherently take as part of the process. Like when you're trying to do a handstand, you kick and you kick and you kick and you kick. And like, I'll take those all day long, and they don't daunt me. They don't make me feel bad about myself. It's only the ones where you fall the rest of the way over where you feel like a dork. But you can only do those if you've actually really committed to trying to do the thing. So you should I walked out of there thinking I should be more ashamed of the kicking and stepping back down without ever getting up there, because those are frankly only half an effort. Like I'm not really kicking with commitment to be up there, because I don't want to risk that tipping, or I don't want to risk overdoing.
Well, that's what I was going to say. There's
if you'd let me finish.
If I had a chance to speak. But what I think is really interesting is the distinction between different types of failure, where one just gives evidence of a lack of commitment, and the other gives evidence of an actual effort, a real try at it. And so I think I just think it's interesting in any endeavor, if you analyze what this lack of success meant. So there's an exercise when you're interviewing somebody, and I've played these games in consultations before, where your response is yes, and that means. Yes, and that means. So somebody could say, I don't want to do that. Yes, and that means, well, I'm uncomfortable because I would look stupid. Yes, and that means I would. And I'm
not quite following on with the yes part of it. You're accepting their answer?
You'll accept their response.
Oh, okay.
But you have to dig deeper, because very often people don't give their true response in the first answer. You dig to the third or the fourth.
Okay.
And so you can do that with the yes, and that means. So with the story, you talk about, okay, I failed. Yes, and that means I didn't get all the way over. Yes, and that means I didn't really kick hard enough. Or I failed. Yes, and that means I went all the way over. Yes, and that means I kicked too hard. And those are two very different things when you get right down to it. I tried too hard is rarely something that is coupled in our minds with failure.
Right. And yet that's the fail. I mean, this is where it doubles back on itself into a weird kind of like chicken egg sort of rationale. Because, trying too hard is not usually the story we write about failure. And yet, how often are we actually, making air quotes, failing because we're not really committing and trying hard enough, because we don't want to risk looking foolish or stupid or I can think of a million business metaphors like this, from everything from the niching conversation. Like, well, I don't want people to think I'm silly if I did that, so I'm going to go with some boilerplate milquetoast branding thing. It goes back to our conversation last week about Rachel's company. She committed to a brand and a persona of company, and it works. When you sort of half commit, it's a different kind of failure, but one that we are probably, unfortunately, comfortable with.
Yeah. I mean, look, I was up at this public speaking conference this past week. And what I noticed in that is the astonishing number of times people would qualify what they're about to present. And they'd say, I only just wrote this last night.
Right.
Okay. Because it's qualification. Why? Because, which is like, I didn't kick hard enough on this thing. Because if it doesn't work, then you know, it's not my best work and whatever.
Pre-tainted the water to lower the expectation.
And I showed that I didn't really do it, as opposed to saying, I gave everything I had to this.
Right.
Because if you say that,
this is everything I got. So if you don't like it,
everything I got. If you don't like it, then it's a real failure. When really the process you went through to give it everything you had was a real victory. That was the commitment.
Right.
And that should be celebrated. And then you look at the result and say, okay, how can we work with this or fix this or tweak it? But you'll never be able to work with it, fix it, or tweak it if you don't even give the effort in the first place. If you qualify, because you're saying, well, it didn't land, but I guess maybe if you had given more effort, we could then see what your best would look like. And
well, there were a couple of things. One more sort of point on this point, and then I also want to talk about the importance of the mat. So if I forget what I was going to say next in a minute, that's what it was. You can help me remember.
Gotcha.
Unless it's not obvious, I'm getting an increasing respect for my lack of memory of late. So I'm putting all these
and you're giving me a roadmap, and I like that. I'm giving you a roadmap. Yeah.
But it reminds me a little bit. My daughter's auditioning for this week. She's auditioning for a part in their school musical, and she's auditioning for the lead. And it's funny, it was before this class, so I didn't have this story to tell her, but I was kind of trying to say the same kind of thing where I said, I know you've never auditioned for a part like this. It's going to be scary. There's going to be a temptation to want to sing the song, because you have to sing the lead song kind of safely.
Yeah, play it safe.
You play it safe because you don't want to mess up. You don't want to look like an idiot. You're going to be a little bit nervous. I said, but the best way to guarantee not getting it is playing it safe and sort of singing out the half side of your mouth, or, playing it small. You have to really swing for the bleachers. And yeah, a little bit you might risk not getting it, but you'll be so, and I didn't have these words specifically, but you really have to commit to it when you audition for a part in anything. And if you overshoot, but undershooting is way more dangerous.
Right. Because, and we've talked about this, because nobody loves vanilla.
Right. Yeah.
It's fine, but you can be beaten if you're just fine. If you want to do it. Now you have to make a big choice.
Yep.
And if somebody doesn't like that choice, then okay.
So this comes back to, because in business, let's be realistic. The sage advice here is not, every time you're up at bat, swing for the bleachers. I mean, there are times to punt. I can't believe I'm using baseball metaphors. This is
Wait,
weird.
But I thought you were just going to say there are times to punt, though.
No, I said bunt.
Bunt.
Isn't it bunt?
Oh, okay,
That's
good.
right.
All right. Okay, good. I'm with you.
That's the end of my baseball metaphors.
All right,
it's like swing for the bleachers and bunt. At least I didn't
mission
say
accomplished,
bunt.
though. Well, I was worried, but okay.
But because there's so many things you have to think about. If your business is teetering on the edge, you're not going to wing way out there into risk zone. So I think there is something, and it goes back to your question about, are you doing this against a wall? Because if you're against a wall, you'll commit to that kick in a handstand. I've been practicing them at home against a wall, and I kick a lot harder because, there's not a window. It's a wall.
Right.
I'm not in the middle of the room.
Because you can't fail that way.
I can't fail that way. Exactly. But interestingly, as a quick side note, because this could be a metaphor too, because I can't fail that way, I wasn't forced to actually do what I learned last night. You're really supposed to be doing with your wrists and hands. I was able to keep them much further out at what felt like the more stable position. Last night, I learned where they're really supposed to be, which feels really awkward at first, but once you realize how the alignment works, you're like, oh, I get it now. I can do it. But that's a whole other piece we don't need to get into. But here's the thing. We could do this experimentation and even have this relationship to commitment the way he was talking about it, because we were in the middle of the room on I'm guessing like a 2-inch thick, maybe even like 3-inch thick mat. And it's very rubbery, which makes the balancing harder, frankly, for some of the yoga poses. But we were safe to fail. Like there was literally, if I go over and I do the accidental back bend, I crashed on my head, and that's okay because there was space there. So I think that's part of it, is thinking through and, metaphorically how that relates to business. It looks like a lot of different things. Like you don't make those giant swings maybe when you're teetering on a cash flow issue, or you can invest in something when you have access to a line of credit, or, I don't know what the metaphors all look like for individual situations, but noticing that you can make it safe to take bigger commitments for risks by making the environment a little bit cushier,
a little
or
bit,
a little bit safer.
So I think that it's interesting because there's a balance between the mat and the wall, because the mat makes the environment safe enough so that you can fully commit and learn the skills necessary to do that stand without support. The wall makes it safe in a different way so that even if you do that stand, you're not properly positioned to do it without support.
Mm-hmm. Well, and here's where that was like a perfect segue to the other point I wanted to make with this story.
Well, you're welcome.
And I will reiterate, you didn't even know this. So I didn't even tell you this story beforehand. So there was also a leadership metaphor in all this, I think. So we're talking about it in terms of like business strategy and the role of commitment. But I think that piece gets into, whether there's a mat or whether you're against a wall, is something else I saw in his class last night. And his name is Jamal. I actually look up his name before, Jamal Pender at the Movement Lab here in Baltimore. Fantastic class. Everyone should come, but not before I sign up, because if the class is full now, I'm going to be mad. I noticed that depending on what he was teaching us, he was focused on what part he was teaching us. And I think this is a really key thing that gets lost in leadership sometimes, is which part do you need them to get at the moment? If you're trying to bring someone along in a mentorship or in a just growing as professional development, it's true that in business, you really need them to know everything all at once, but you can't teach everything all at once.
Well, you certainly can't learn everything.
And you can't learn everything all at once. So I could tell that, this is a guy that, to put a metaphor on a metaphor, like he knows the physics of this thing and he's breaking it down so that we can learn the like basic, arithmetic of it, the addition and subtraction. He knows physics. He gets all these tiny pieces, but he's like, just in this moment, we're just going to work on this one piece. Because if you get this piece, then you can use it in these 5 other places. So there were places where we didn't literally use the wall in this class, but it would be as if he said, for this thing, I want you to just understand. Well, actually, so he became the wall. He would go around, and there were a couple of times with me, he wanted me to feel what it would feel like being in a handstand if I committed and got all the way up. So he stood there. He's like, kick like you're trying to kick over into a back bend. I kicked that hard. He caught my feet, and then he like pulled up to show me that really doing a handstand, it's actually not even about balance. It's about actually like lifting your hips almost, which is a feeling that I couldn't even imagine what he meant when he said it until he became the wall actually in that instance, because he wanted me to learn a very specific piece of it. Not that I could then do it, but at least I understood the concept, because he didn't try and teach it all at once. And this is, all teachers do this, all good teachers do this, is being more myopically focused on, okay, what's the one piece I want this person to understand? What's the building block they need to get so that then they can do the next thing?
Well, it's interesting because I'm thinking about this as onboarding or bringing on new people. And as we've talked about, I'm working on some online courses, and I start thinking about the foundations. What's the first building block that you need? But what I find and I've done this myself, bringing on new people, I could look at their job description. I could look at the skills that I want them to have. And if I gave some real thought to it, I could even figure out the foundational skills that they should have before moving off to the next one and how to scaffold it. But a lot of times what happens is they come in and I need them to start in the middle because there's an emergency project.
Right.
And so I haven't laid any kind of foundation. I'm like, you just do this.
Do a headstand.
And do a headstand. And then we'll come back to proper, where your wrists and hands should be.
Which sometimes is a great learning. Sometimes, like, I learn well in a sort of throw you into the fire pan environment, but not always. Not for this, not the thing I was trying to learn last night.
Both sides have to be comfortable with that. It's often referred to something as, just throw you in and see if you can swim.
Yep.
So not only does the employee have to be comfortable with a higher probability of failure
right.
in a new position, but the company has to actually be comfortable with that higher probability of failure and not judge the employee harshly, because it's really the company's failure. And I've worked with a lot of professionals, quite a few of whom are lawyers, who will automatically deem the employee, support staff or whatever, to be incompetent when really, and so a judgment is made and they will stop working with this person, or they will, having judged her, will not give her the important projects.
Right.
But really, the problem has been that they'd never laid the foundation. They just had an immediate need and needed her to do a handstand immediately, without any instruction, without even being the wall.
Yeah. Well, and just imagine if we tie it back to the commitment thing. If you have somebody, if he hadn't been showing us the building blocks and then all of a sudden, if he wasn't standing there as the wall, or if he wasn't, many of the things that he kind of broke it down into pieces, and then he was judging me because I'm not showing commitment to throwing my feet straight up in the air when I don't know how to do a handstand.
So you shouldn't be in this class, or you don't have the ability.
Why are you not even here? Yeah, I mean, you can totally see how that happens in a business. Like, well, look, she's not even trying. Well, it's because I'm terrified. And actually, once I fell over, that was the other thing. I realized falling over wasn't such a big deal. I didn't snap my neck.
But that is a huge thing, because if you fully commit and it doesn't work out, if you have the environment in which it's not a life or death situation, it's not a horrible thing.
Well, and in last night's case, I just so happened, it happened like 5 times after I did, but in that class, and I only just started taking them, I just so happened to be the first and only person that flopped on over the other way. So I felt particularly embarrassed by it. Like, oh my gosh, I look like the person who can't do the thing. Now, meanwhile, especially after he made that speech, it was happening a lot of times because he was like, you should be flopping over that way.
Well, he gave permission and he celebrated the positive thing of that.
Yeah, it was just like one really fascinating metaphor after another. And
way to go, Jamal.
I know. It's also just a fantastic class, but it was interesting to think about the role of commitment. Because I think of commitment in 2 completely different ways. Like commitment, there's one version of it where I think of it as a very long-term thing. Like you commit to something like, when somebody says they're non-committal, I don't think as much about like a momentary thing. Like, do you commit to something and give it your all in the moment? I think of sort of like signing up for a long-term contract. Right. And I do think that that's part of someone being non-committal, is an unwillingness to sign up for a long-term contract. But I think it's also useful to think of it even in these like little interstitial spaces, these moments between moments or little bursts of things that you do. Do you really commit to it, or and risk falling all the way over, or do you kind of, dabble into it and, sort of dabble your way so as not to risk falling over, but then,
and I think the important part of that distinction is for each side, and we're using it in business, so the employee and the employer, for each side to have a clear understanding of what the different types of failure are and what they mean. Mm-hmm. If you don't kick up all the way, well, that means you didn't commit. And if you kick over, although it looks like a more dramatic failure, it means you made a big choice.
Yeah. And that you commit. It's interesting. I keep saying that I would love to see a transcript how many times I've said the word commitment in this, but that it's for the last 14 hours I've just been wearing sort of these like commitment glasses of looking at in what ways do we hold back from things, and not just in business, with my kids and with my husband and with friends. Where do we hold back, and where do you swing for the bleachers? And where does it feel like you're in the safe zone because you're just sort of like, and you have this story of like, well, I'm trying. When I was doing the handstands, I'm like, well, look at me, I'm trying, I'm trying, I keep trying, but I wasn't really trying. And I'll tell you, when he stood there as the wall and I kicked all the way up, the place that I needed to be kicking to was like bone terrifying because it felt like I was all the way. I felt like I was already toppling over. If I were going to draw a picture of the position that I was in, I would have thought I was like 10 degrees past straight up. So I didn't even have an awareness of where I was kicking to. And so it's just very interesting, like exploring the whole arc of how far your effort needs to go is something I'm going to continue.
Yeah, I just love it because even in business, I just think that you have to have an employee who is willing to, kick all the way over, and an employer who's willing to be the wall. So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories.
Your stories.
You can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best of
Lovingly
ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us.
Which
is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.